a few years earlier in 1941 that health is not simply the absence of disease, it is something positive. A healthy individual is well balanced bodily and mentally and well adjusted to his physical and social environment. So I think for me, this is a kind of quintessential illustration of the fact that at its very core, WHO thinking about health is something that is influenced by humanities scholars, humanities thinking. And that's really something that the Cultural Context of Health project hopes to enlarge on and hopes to reintroduce a little bit into WHO's thinking. So we talk about culture, and within WHO, for those who don't immediately turn off, there's a very quick question about what does culture actually mean. So we do have to engage with this topic, even though I have to say I'm always a little bit reluctant to define culture. For our purposes, we use the UNESCO Universal Declaration of Cultural Diversity definition. It's not our remit within the UN agency system to define culture, so we look to our sister agency to do that for us. And I think in this case, it works okay because it is broad, it is kind of slightly woolly, and it gives us a lot of opportunity to work. But there are many others, from the deeply historical definitions of culture to the very succinct definitions of culture to the kind of inspirational definitions of or aspirational definitions of culture that we all kind of think about. But ultimately, I don't think it is hugely important that we have a very specific word-for-word understanding of culture. I think we all understand that it relates to practices and beliefs and values. But I think where we try to raise a little bit more awareness of, and this might seem incredibly obvious to all of you, but sometimes it's forgotten, I think, within the walls of WHO, is that culture is dynamic. Culture is not monolithic. It's not just a question of race and ethnicity. It's not just a question of geography. And that culture is something that we all have and that we all bring to the table, whether it's part of a community of practice or it's even just part of two people sitting down talking to each other. So the CCH project is looking to give a platform to culture. And the question is, why is that important? And I think it's important because it enables us to have a place where we can have complex and yes, sometimes slightly fuzzy conversations. It enables us not just to talk about black and white or even shades of gray, but to examine the entire spectrum of light. It allows us to talk about religion. It allows us to talk about spirituality, as well as anti-vaccination, universal health care, and antibiotic resistance. But I think when we do so, we want to do so rigorously. And I think this is where traditions within WHO have perhaps sometimes fallen down a little bit. There's no question within WHO when it comes to drawing up normative guidelines or action plans or documents such as those that we refer to public health experts, biomedical experts, experts from the sciences and the medical sciences. But when it comes to localizing those action plans, translating them on the ground, we often have to rely on individuals who are program managers or WHO representatives or ministers of health, who may only be aware of relevant cultural contexts through the narrow lens of their own unconscious biases, and who haven't been trained necessarily to understand those. So this is, I think, what Cultural Context of Health wants to change. It wants to bring the same kind of rigor, the same kind of academic rigor to understanding cultural context as we naturally at WHO bring towards understanding the scientific and the medical and the public health contexts. Its vision is to enhance public health policymaking through a more nuanced understanding of how cultural contexts affect health and health care. It's guided by an expert group, which you see here, that meets once a year, and that's composed of a huge variety of experts from different geographies within the WHO European region. It incorporates a number of disciplines, both from the social sciences, the humanities, public health, and medicine, and it attempts to create this platform, this seat at the table for humanities and social science scholarship to be part of at least WHO Europe and its policy-making processes. It has several focus areas. I mean, this is one of the challenges of taking on board a topic that is as kind of rich and complex as culture and health. Ultimately, culture and health is everywhere, from the cradle to the grave, as it were, from the bench to the bedside. So we've had to kind of focus down on certain topics and work with some colleagues that were particularly geared up and interested. So we have focus areas on nutrition, migration, environment, and mental health. But at its core, the project has three main objectives. It wants to create a focus for culture and health at the WHO Regional Office for Europe in order to contribute to the implementation of its policy work and to strengthen the regional office's position on achieving the health-related sustainable development goals and not just not just SDG 3, which is specifically with health, but I mean, effectively all the sustainable development goals have elements of health to them. And as a consequence, as I've said, create a seat at the table for humanities and science, social science scholarship. It wants to strengthen action-oriented health and health and social science, humanities and social science research and policy analysis, and encourage the dissemination of that research and those methodological approaches into the public health sphere. And it wants to promote, or we aim to promote, the validity and the use of an interdisciplinary evidence base for health-related policy and practice that draws on and incorporates the subjective lived experience of health. So I'm going to say a little bit about those three core objectives by giving you an example of some publications that we've outputted in the last couple of years. The first of these is relating to the first objective, creating a focus for culture and health at the WHO Regional Office for Europe. So as you can imagine, we're a little bit of a satellite, a little bit of an outlier. So a lot of what we're still doing is advocacy. We're still trying to convince colleagues within the office that what we're doing is important. It's not just relevant, but it's important. And the kind of cornerstone for publication of the project is one called Culture Matters, using a cultural context of health approach to enhance policymaking. This policy brief has essentially three objectives. It reiterates a UCL Lancet Commission on Culture and Health that was published in 2014, which points out that the systematic neglect of culture in health and healthcare is the single biggest barrier to the advancement of the highest standard of health worldwide. And it takes this statement, this strong statement, and it applies it to the policy process. And it says that even in healthcare policymaking, it is a subjective process, and decisions are rarely based on fact alone. And that it is often also emotions, and that we need to understand the cultural context of these emotions. Culture is everywhere, even or perhaps especially amongst policymakers. And I think within the context of WHO, you won't find many people who don't know this or don't agree with this, but it's something that is not often explicitly talked about. And finally, the policy brief also illustrates the point using several case studies how this effectively happens in the health process. So one area where this is perhaps the most kind of evident and obvious is in the area of nutritional advice. WHO, as a normative organization, is very good at producing guidelines that talk about nutritional balance and the biochemistry of eating. But of course, in eating, there's what some scholars have called the kind of pre and post swallowing world. What happens after you swallow food is the kind of biochemical process. But what happens before, and that is really the large majority of the kind of food trajectory, is predominantly cultural. How we source our food, how we cook our food, how we eat our food. All these parts of the kind of the food experience are vitally important and also have potentially very real health consequences. So in France, for instance, we know that meals, even though they may not be nutritionally, from a nutritional value, the most healthy meals, expand over, say, a 2-hour lunch or dinner session, and that these intangible cultural heritage practices actually have positive health benefits. And I think that idea that culture is not just an impediment, that it's not just about anti-vaccination or female genital mutilation at its worst, cultural practices that have real detrimental health effects, but that cultural practices also have positive value, that tapping into those positive values can help us promote health. That's one of the key ambitions for the CCH project. So the second objective that I mentioned is to strengthen action-oriented health and social science, humanities and social science research and policy analysis. And this is where I'm going to refer to a second publication which we've just launched, which is about antibiotic resistance, and it's called Antibiotic Resistance Using a Cultural Context of Health Approach to Address a Global Health Challenge. So the idea about this policy brief is that it kind of counters the notion that the solution to the crisis of antibiotic resistance is purely a medical one, that all we have to do is replenish the pipeline and our problems are solved. And to emphasize instead that a wide variety of social and commercial and cultural drivers influence the prescription use of antibiotics, and that these are vitally important if we want to manage the ABR crisis. So in fact, the policy brief highlights how the charm-like quality of antibiotics and the myth of the magic bullet narrative, which accomplished the seeming success of penicillin, gave rise to such infamous statements as in 1967 by William Stewart, the Surgeon General of the United States of America, who famously said at the time that the time has come to close the book on infectious disease. That was the kind of statement by the kind of top health voice in the U.S. in 1967. But in fact, the problem of antibiotic resistance was well known from the outset. Acute bacteriologists, such as Mary Barber, who pioneered early resistance studies, were keenly aware of the rising false narrative. So Mary Barber wrote in 1948. I mean, probably shouldn't have said 1948. I should have just read this quote and asked you when you thought it was written. The drug penicillin received such acclaim in the early 40s that it became to be regarded by many in the nature of a charm, the mere sight of which was sufficient to make all bacteria tremble. Nothing, of course, could be further from the truth, and the present widespread and often indiscriminate use of penicillin, particularly as a preventive measure, is seriously menacing its future reputation. I think the only thing that gives away that this was written in 1948 is that it's good writing, and it really kind of draws on metaphor. So the policy brief looks at cultural contexts such as these and makes the following arguments. It argues against the idea of this concept of irrational use of antibiotics, and for the importance of understanding contextual decisions. For example, given the pressures to sustain hierarchical professional cultures, or the desire to protect the physician-patient relationship in an area of medical consumerism, or the need to maximize livestock production in increasingly challenging economic circumstances, the decision of overusing antibiotics is highly irrational. People make very rational decisions about why they prescribe antibiotics. The policy brief explains how the mantra of treat hard and treat long is a culturally contingent form of knowledge, and that even though research is showing that shorter treatment cycles can actually be equally effective with regard to certain bacterial infections, there's very much resistance to go against decades-long ingrained guidance. The policy brief criticizes the conventional diffusion model, this idea that we should go out and preach the gospel and tell people what to do, whether they are practitioners or healthcare practitioners or users of antibiotics, and instead advocates a form of engaging in co-production of knowledge, getting people involved in research and decision-making processes so that they're more bought in and more engaged. And it taps into the humanities tradition of questioning linear narratives, supporting the idea that health education campaigns should move towards a more careful engagement with the limits of scientific knowledge. The idea of moving away from the kind of scientific or medical positivism that science will save us. Science alone will save us, I should perhaps say. So we've talked about two objectives. The final objective is about increasing the acceptance of a more interdisciplinary evidence base. And I think that's very kind of it's very important. It's a very kind of crucial part of the CCH project. We want to put out the message that qualitative research is important not just from a kind of communications perspective, which is I think how it's often treated within WHO, but that it is actually a fundamental component to enhancing the evidence base for policy decision making. That understanding qualitative narratives, lived experiences, is an important component to convince people of the effectiveness of health policy. So this is really about true interdisciplinarity, not just about interdisciplinarity in the sciences or in public health. It's about offering a seat at the table for historians, philosophers, literature academics, as well as epidemiologists and public health specialists. Now, I mean, I have to kind of take a step back here and emphasize, being a kind of WHO person, that quantitative data is still fundamentally important to what we do, and we completely accept that. But given that WHO and other organizations are moving towards taking concepts like well-being more seriously, I think it's vital that we accept that we can't have these kinds of conversations without qualitative information. If I sat down with any of you, and hopefully I have this chance after the presentation, if we sit down and we have a chat and I ask you how you're doing, you may initially respond with a kind of rating-like suggestion. I'm doing terrible, I'm doing okay, or I'm doing very good. But our conversation wouldn't stop there. We would talk about themes, topics, questions in your life that are important to you and that give me a sense of what your preoccupations, what your ideas about well-being are. And this is the kind of idea that we took as a starting point for a pilot report, which we've commissioned and which is reporting on the well-being of Italy. So this is supported by the WHO Collaborating Center on Culture and Health at the University of Exeter. And it draws on well-being evidence that can be gained through humanities and social science approaches, paying particular attention to the potential of themes expressed in works of popular culture like film, literature, arts and media, to complement the understanding of country-level and individual well-being. Now, we still report on key quantitative metrics like subjective and objective well-being indicators, the availability of social support, Gini coefficients, unemployment rates, or life satisfaction. But none of these indicators give us any nuance or indeed much insight into the lived experience of well-being. So, to give you two examples. While the statistics we report on might lead us to consider that there are few substantive differences between the well-being of men and women in Italy, a cultural context analysis shows that, like in many other European countries, the issue of feminicide, so that's the kind of killing of women by a man for the fact of being a woman, has become a deeply important cultural issue. In Italy, it's given rise to an important grassroots movement. It was a focus of a critically acclaimed theatrical piece, the topic of documentary by a well-known TV journalist, and it was the subject of 12 further books, including by the distinguished Italian writer Loredana Liperini, all in the short period of 2011 to 2013. So it was a veritable kind of cultural explosion for this kind of topic. And conversely, we can look to the statistics to show us we can refer to the statistics which make clear that the fragmentation of the family is a real phenomenon in Italy. But to capture a glimpse of what this means is very difficult by just referring to numbers. And instead, it might help, as we did in the report, to turn to a film by Gabriele Nuniccio, which is called A casa tutti bene, at home everything is fine, which opens with the line, "They say that the family is our starting point, then our fleeing point, and eventually the point to which we return." And it captures, at least according to some critics, the challenging monstrosity of today's Italian family ideal. So I'm kind of coming to the end of what I have to say. As is the nature with kind of 20-minute presentations, you gloss over a huge amount and you try to reduce everything to very short sound bites. And that is, to some extent, antithetical to the idea of a humanities approach, which tries to be a little bit more expansive, a little bit more nuanced, and a little bit more complex. But within the publications that we produce, I think we very much give space for that kind of thinking. So we produce evidence synthesis reports. We've commissioned one, for instance, on men's health-seeking behaviors in relation to mental health, where we have a British social scientist working with a Russian scholar of Eastern European literature who look at the development of toxic masculinities, their historical components, and how they play out in different parts of the region. We have another Hen report on migration and cultural sensitivity training within and cultural mediators within the domain of migration, and how cultural mediators are trained within the European region, where the shortcomings are and where we might improve on this kind of training. We produce policy briefs like the one, the two that I mentioned earlier. We're in the process of commissioning another one on thinking through local food practices and how tapping into local food practices might help us, or at least the health benefits of local food practices might help us better articulate or work with communities to eat more healthily. We have a flagship publication at WHO Europe called Public Health Panorama, which is uniquely published in 2 languages, in Russian and in English, which is a forum for all sorts of kind of public health topics, where we have an upcoming special issue on culture and health. And of course, we organize many meetings and workshops and go to events such as this one. But maybe just to conclude, some of this might be incredibly obvious to some of you, to some of the scholars in this room. But that's not necessarily to say that in the world of public health, this is it's as obvious. It's as that people think in the same kind of way. So I think what my role is and what this presentation is about is to extend an invitation to consider how your research can be made relevant to public health policy making. Even if you're in the domain of literature, cultural studies, history, I think what we're trying to do is create a seat at the table. And the invitation is for you to join us and sit down. Thank you.
So I have to put this slide up first. This is the corporate slide for the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And I'm in the very strange position of being a historian at a school of public health, which is possibly even stranger than being working on policy around cultural contexts of health in the WHO. I'd like to echo Niels in thanking our hosts, the Global Health History Seminar, Hughes Hall, and all who have brought us here today together. It's a real privilege to come and speak here, and it's wonderful also to follow Niels, who's really talked to us a little bit about putting ideas and thinkers to work. Setting a place at the table for people who don't normally engage with public health work to come in and infuse public health work with some of their ideas, some of their reflections, and render it truly interdisciplinary. Whereas Niels shows us some ways in which perhaps culture can be operationalized in decision making. For me, it's more a question of sitting with stories that have unfolded over the course of research that I've carried out over the past 15, 20 years. And the stories that I'll tell, in these stories, I will be, somewhat of an ingenue, just coming in, wandering in, blundering in a way to find one history and uncovering something else, uncovering a very different type of conversation around health-seeking behavior, the potentials, the successes and failures of public health, and what these mean in people's lives. I'll be, shining some lights really, and the word here, some, in some African possibilities is very important. It's not really a generalizing that I'll be doing in the course of the next 15, 20 minutes, but really identifying specific, the how and where of health and health seeking. How and where does it function socially? How and where do cultural possibilities unfold? I open in Nigeria, and here we have a picture of a concert hall, and the reasons will become clear. It's a stand-in a way here for culture. It's a concert hall at a very prominent site of colonial and post-colonial leprosy control and leprosy chemotherapeutic research, Uzuakoli in Nigeria. And I went to Uzuakoli first in 2006 to try and find out about the trials of some drugs that were carried out there. So two of the three most prominent, two of the three drugs still used as part of the multi-drug regimen for treating leprosy were either first trialed or their dosage was standardized at the Leprosy Research Unit in Uzuakoli in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. So we're talking about the period, the colonial period, but also the early post-colonial period. And so culturally, huge shifts are taking place. Also, huge shifts are taking place in who has control over institutions, who has power in institutions, who is able to determine the allocation of resources, how money is spent. Now, I went in search of this story of some clinical trials. You can see here some dates. We go from 1967. There's a little bit of a jump there to 1971. There was a civil war in Nigeria in the late 1960s. And the civil war, while it interrupted the treatment for leprosy in a lot of places in eastern Nigeria, which seceded from the Federal Republic in 1967, the actual recording apparatus and the work that was done in these places wasn't destroyed. So you still had in 1971, when you came back, paperwork, records to pick up on, to follow up on. You can see here a reference to December 1967 when treatment was interrupted, and then it was resumed in 1971. And you have this big hole in the middle of the page. Now, this hole represents the failures of the 1980s and 90s. The failure of the state through the 1980s and 90s to protect investment in public health, to sort of capitalize on what was there, to keep it going. And so it sort of speaks of difficulties in protecting this material. It was eaten by termites because it spent years by this open window in these stacks of bound volumes, bound records, and so on here. And so I came, and my hosts were disappointed on my behalf that I wasn't going to be able to tell the story I wanted to tell as a historian by looking through these records. And this scene, captures some of the tenor of medical administrative neglect that people experienced in their everyday lives as people who are working in the field of health, or people who were patients seeking chronic care, living in the sort of the remnants of the old colonial leprosy control institution. When I went back in 2015, this is what I found. This is the same building, and it had been burnt down in the interim by a dissatisfied, disgruntled patient who wasn't getting treatment, and wasn't getting treatment for a wide variety of complex problems. And his response was to burn down the records center. So the records, there's now absolutely no possibility of finding the story that I wanted to find. But these aren't the stories that people want to hear and tell. When they think about the legacy of Whu-Oh, of the treatment that went on there, of the work that was done there, there's another story, another history here, which really does force a cultural reckoning. And this is the story of the man on the right here, Harcourt White, who was a choral composer, a leprosy patient, and a treatment activist. So in the 1920s, himself and some fellow sufferers were abandoned in Port Harcourt in the shell of the infectious diseases hospital. They banded together and they demanded a hospital, a setting where they could be treated with dignity, would be able to work for themselves, would be able to run their own farms, and so on and so forth. And the response to that was to create the Centre at Whu-Oh in the 1930s. He went there, he became a teacher, he worked with one of the leprosy superintendents, who was an organist, a church organist, and learnt how to compose for 4-part choral harmony. And every week from the 1940s through to the end of his life, he composed a weekly hymn, which transmuted this cultural occasion of Sunday church at the leprosy colony into extended meditation on chronic care, on the entanglements around chronic care and treatment, and it sort of harnessed the power and potency of the cultural exchange of musics, the variety of things that happen in a life lived in a segregation hospital. All of these currents, European, African, biomedical, spiritual, cultural, all in together. And it really was sort of a remarkable story which touched a huge number of people in eastern Nigeria. So Harcourt White's music is still performed regularly in church services by professional and amateur choirs. It was recorded, it was on television throughout the 1960s. This is a recording which I think may have been funded by Shell. So it sort of also harnesses the energies of globalization of oil and oil production. And it also inspired a generation of musicians and musicologists in Nigeria. The man here on the left is Kanu Achinivu, emeritus professor of music at University of Nigeria in Nsukka, who did a degree on Harcourt White's music, a doctoral degree on Harcourt White's music in Germany, and really, continues to mobilize and galvanize energy and cultural energy and interest around this, around Harcourt White's music. It's a story which builds on the embodiment of treatment, which is exemplified by Harcourt White, who was experimented on, or allowed himself to be experimented on rigorously in the search for a treatment that would allow him to be discharged from the settlement. And it places the work of people like Achinivu, the cultural work of people like Achinivu, then places the music that came out of the medical setting at the heart of national and community narratives. This is his amateur choir in Arochukwu, where he grew up and returned to at the end of his career. And he brought them to the church, the Chapel of Hope at the Uzwakali Leprosy Center for a choral competition dedicated to raise funds to re-roof the church. And so the music is at the heart of spiritual life, it's at the heart of an intergenerational life, and it's also part of a restorative and reparative agenda. So when people talk about Uzwakali, talk about the medical work that goes on there, the story of the miracle cures, the two drugs at the heart of MDT today for leprosy treatment worldwide, is not really an interesting, not really a salient, not really a galvanizing story. The story which galvanizes people is this story of Nigerian agency and Nigerian music. It's a story of commemoration, but we have to acknowledge that it's set amid evidence of decline, of dereliction. This is Harcourt White's tomb. There's no inscription on it, nothing. It's outside the church, which is also suffering the elements. Now, normally when I give this presentation, there's plenty of music playing in the background. Because I'm not just focusing on Uzwakali, I have not put any music because it tends to just carry on through, the next slides, the next stories. But the music is striking. It's available. You can search for it on Amazon. You can, it is out there. And I do recommend to listen, especially if you've got any interest in choral, 20th century choral traditions. I turn now really to a very, very different story and a very different place, which is Ayos in Cameroon. Ayos is to the east of Yaoundé. It's the medical complex there inherits the mantle of first German and then French colonial medicine in Cameroon. In both the German and the French case, it was a center of sleeping sickness control. And sleeping sickness control was very, very militarized in the French colonial, in French colonial territories. It was also not particularly focused on cure, but on the prevention of transmission. So the actual element of care of people infected with sleeping sickness, wasn't really a question of interest to the French. They just wanted it to stop spreading. And Ayos was the place where they trained and from where they sent out brigades of sleeping sickness inspectors in the 1930s and 1940s. And it continues to be a location where you see an infusion of development capital. So you can see these nice new roofs here and the old roofs in the background. There's money going in to make sure that this hospital complex keeps running, that it keeps functioning as a referral hospital. And so you have new technologies coming in, and then you also have old materials which are dispersed. These bricks from the old hospital buildings that were built by the Germans are seen as extremely good building materials. The Germans did everything right. When the buildings they built didn't fall. So there are all sorts of rumors going around Ayos at the moment about what happened to these bricks, where they went. Were they just taken to Yaoundé to build ministers' houses? This is one of the sort of common charges you hear. In fact, actually, most of them are stashed around the village in people's houses, and everyone pretends that they don't have any of them. But it is a very charismatic location, a swamp across the bend in the Nyong River, which it has a long and complex medical history and in a distinctive and diverse medical institutional setting. It's also this basin and the conditions around here make it a focus of Buruli ulcer, so a very debilitating chronic condition mycobacterial infection, mostly infecting poor local residents engaged in seasonal fishing. And Ios is one of the key focal points of Buruli ulcer and one of the key treatment locations. So it's a place of education. This is the Centre d'Instruction Médicale, a nurse training school on the site. And so we see across Ios lives and careers built in close contact with this institutional investment and the assumed permanence of buildings like this. But it's also a place of chronic care of people with leprosy, people with mycobacterial infections, and the expertise that develops around the practices of caring and the relations of care with people who are long-term residents of these buildings in the hospital. So among the nurses, there's a very, very strong investment in the place and a strong sense of the status that comes from working in health in this place. For these two men, Daniel Zebekolo, who's an indigene of the area, who became a nurse after suffering with Buruli ulcer himself, and Thomas Kombang, who was born in the leprosarium on the site to two parents who were incarcerated there, became a nurse and raised the money to build his own house. He also showed us the house, the area where the bush had overgrown the house that he grew up in, and he was very keen that we take a photo of him in front of that and in front of this house that he managed to build from the fruits of his own labour. So the story of our trip to Ios was actually a story of how these nurses and local notables would walk us through their careers, their lives, and show us how they had made medical work had helped them establish themselves as personages, as important people locally, politically, inheritors of the traditions of the old colonial nurses, the name Jameau, for Eugène Jameau, a prominent colonial doctor, is everywhere in Ios. But people don't remember Jameau, they remember the people Jameau hired, the people who stayed around, the local, mostly men, who used their association with Jameau to signify status, to take stakes in local politics. And here, showing the place of work, showing the entanglements in the hospital, demonstrating their rights to walk and move through the hospital, and showing us, what the commemorations actually meant, what the underlying stories of commemoration were. The sort of commemoration, this is also, a monument to Jameau, but it says at the bottom, ses amis et ses élèves, his friends and students. So it's actually a way of memorializing their own association with Jameau, of commemorating their own association with the heritage of health work, with the political stakes that it enabled to emerge. For us, it also raised questions of their presence in the hospital, but their erasure from the texts that were written, the research work that was done. So the nurses basically made all the research work, identified the research problems, but were usually written out of the research reports. So one of the key pieces of work that we did was to bring the nurses whose photos I've shown there in as co-authors in an article in one of the journals which normally rejected their authorship. And this was their idea. This was something that they wanted to do. They wanted to do very strongly, and so they are the named authors on this. And we, in a reversal, acknowledged the assistance of the medical staff at the hospital, which was which for us was a very interesting way of thinking through all of the sorts of questions of partnership and inequality that arise in the cultural contexts of public health and health research in Africa in the 21st century. I will just take a couple of minutes to sort of note what I think is going to happen next. And this is really looking at what it is that partnership mobilizes, what it promises, and what hopes are vested in it, despite its often unsatisfactory nature. And here we come to the Gambia, to Farafenni and Keneba. This is Farafenni, which had been run as a part of the MRC program in the Gambia, and was given to the University of the Gambia in 2010 for their climate change school, the research school, which is underfunded to the point of inactivity. The man here is the caretaker of the MRC, was the caretaker of the MRC campus and is now the caretaker of the University of the Gambia campus. And he took us around showing us really buildings in which things are supposed to be happening now, but really with reference to what had happened when partnership was working under the aegis of the MRC, however unsatisfactory that was in many other ways. And you know, we see that partnership has all sorts of material consequences and possibilities that it offers in a terrain that's otherwise marked by resource poverty, by a lack of resources, that it does give people opportunities to position themselves, to rethink their own roles, to inhabit, to do cultural work around medical practice. And it's to the capture of some of this you know, that I'm interested in moving on to now, very much, again, working very closely with people who are developing working lives around the apparatus of global public health in circumstances such as in Gambia, where there's, you know, the MRC is so huge, so charismatic in comparison to pretty much anything else that could be mobilized in the Gambian health space. And so everywhere it goes, it sends out ripples and it reorients people's personal community projects, the plans that they have, the plans that they can make. So I'm just going to fire through these. And sort of leave it with another sort of poignant, holy document. You know, it's a spiritual note bound in with a bunch of leprosy reports. Sort of, you know, it reminds us that on many sides the spiritual and the medical were commingled. And there's a huge range of stories which emerge from that, a huge range of accommodations, projects and plans which emerge from that. And there's a very strong, and we think, shared desire for a history of this legacy in places where, you know, there has been historic underinvestment. That there is a desire to do some of the cultural work around what it means to be in partnership around global health. Thank you.
We hope to get a microphone across here. Sanjoy, would you like to join us up here? And Echo as well. We have a panel of 4 people. There are questions I'm sure to ask of the people who presented to us. And there are questions in general. And one of the objectives of what we're doing now in this particular program is that in fact people from the humanities should be in the same room discussing with people from the traditional people who work in the biomedical field, so we can start to have the debate so that we can actually be brought to the table and that actually a meaningful debate will happen. So, are we going to get one of the microphones across there? This is a microphone which will work for you. We should have said probably at the beginning that they're recording this and that we are also streaming it. And that's up to us to be part of the WHO collection of meetings that goes on. If you want to have the recording afterwards, you have the link that we can actually help you with there. Are there any questions I can hand them up? Questioners I can hand the microphone to so we can start going. And perhaps you could just say who you are and your discipline.
Okay, hi, my name is Onyinye. I'm a Nigerian. I'm doing public policy. It's a master's program. And this is quite an interesting conversation for me because it's something I've worked on. So I did a lot of health work before I came here, but that's not my background. And I'm quite keen on the cultural aspect because I believe that culture plays a huge role in terms of our the way we seek health caring behavior and things like that. My question is, now I know WHO is looking at this critically, but then I also understand that this is just the Eastern Europe region. So how about other bits and pieces of WHO around the world? And then also, how much partnership has gone into understanding culture, not just from this end, but from actually the communities themselves and the people themselves in those regions, and trying to bring that all into policy making, because nowadays we are in a world where everybody believes that policy making should just be based on quantitative evidence, but qualitative evidence is also very important, and I totally believe that. So what's the progress like in terms of just taking it around WHO, but also pushing it to, like, for people to understand this is important, and what progress has been like?
So that's a tough question in the sense that I'd like. In reality, I think it's very mixed and spotty. I should maybe clarify that the project that I'm leading comes out of the European Regional Office. So it's not just Eastern Europe, it's WHO Europe, which is actually much bigger than geographical Europe. It includes Central Asia, Commonwealth of Independent States. It's kind of a little bit more like Eurovision than Europe. But so 53 member states in total. And I think in that context, we're making small but important steps to bring colleagues on board, to create processes that survive just the deployment of within a certain health emergency state. I think generally what happens is WHO has a particular issue. It may apply, the people who are working on this issue may apply social science or even broader interdisciplinary approaches to that problem, but then the lessons are forgotten because it's not transmitted horizontally across the organization. So I think that's really where what we are doing with the Cultural Context of Health project is slightly new and slightly different. We're trying to create a repository for this type of approach and a more consistent, hopefully long-living voice for qualitative evidence, interdisciplinary research, etc. So the progress is slow and it's patchy, but I think it's real.
I think that's a very good question as well. In terms of, as Neil described, this is more WHO Europe. But I know that discussions are also going on in WHO culture afro, though not as advanced as perhaps is in Euro office. But cultural context discussion has been taking place now strongly since the last Ebola issues in Sierra Leone, which has clearly shown that interventions will not be successful without really engaging the communities, understanding their culture. So everybody is waking up to that reality in Africa. The issues recently you may have had, there was a big discussion around Lassa fever in Nigeria also, which begins to recognize it's not just the discovery of the virus, it's issues about culture and about participation around that. So overall, I think there is a strong movement within Africa that for Africa to be able to achieve sustainable health improvement, the solutions are within cultural assets of Africa. So there is an asset-based approach to that, to look at what is strong rather than what is wrong. And that is the movement now that is taking place. And Sandra will probably talk about, he just came back from Zimbabwe. There are academic institutions within Africa that are also taking cultural context into and history of medicine as a very strong discipline so that you can begin to capture the kind of stories that we've just had in Izoku and many other parts of Africa, which is not well captured within global Western history about it. We know that a lot of other Africans have played crucial roles within development of and advancement of medicine and co, but they are not well captured there. So perhaps when we have scholars like this highlighting that, it gives perspective and it gives ambition, but also solutions to how problems can be addressed. I think there's a good movement on it. Okay.
I mean, I think that point about cultural assets is hugely significant. You know, that culture is not to be seen as an impediment, something to be understood to see why things don't work properly. And, you know, and I think in the early, the Ebola outbreak in West Africa was a eureka moment for anthropologists. I think they realized that, you know, they were drafted in to see, okay, what's wrong? What's wrong with these people that we can't treat them? You know, and the anthropologists originally went in thinking that was their scope was to do a 2-week mission and actually report on that, but actually they found there was much more they could do, that, you know, they could really enrich the understanding. But that is still, in its nature, a bunch of you know, Europeans going down and doing sort of reports and works and engagements. But there is a medical humanities initiative at the moment going on in African universities to try and raise the profile of medical humanities work in Africa. And I think that is going to be absolutely key in realizing the cultural assets, as it were, in relation to public health.
Does everybody know the story of the anthropologists and Ebola? No? Come on, John, you could tell it, I'm sure.
Well, some of it is an LSHTM story, and it's the LSHTM side of it that I probably know best. But, you know, there have been anthropologists working in you know, forest resources, community resource management, and so on and so forth in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, in Guinea for 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years. And you know, they immediately twigged that what is going on here is you know, an overinvestment, an overcapitalizing of strategies which aren't going to work because they disrupt the way people seek health and deal with illness. And so they sort of constituted themselves really in a way as a platform, an anthropology platform, to go out and interrogate and challenge the basis on which the initial Ebola control work was being carried out. And they embedded themselves in the vaccine programs, in the policy networks, in just about everything. And I mean, you know, anthropology, though it's a social science and therefore better funded than the humanities, it still sees itself as, you know, underfunded. And I think the Ebola moment is part of a gambit for better funding for anthropology, as well as a very interesting story about how you can make a cultural intervention in disease control.
Can I add a little bit to that?
Sure.
Just to make it kind of concrete, and you know, as I said, I'm not an expert, so do correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's useful to give a kind of a concreteness to this. So one of the challenges was that this kind of goes back to what I was saying about antibacterial resistance and this idea of irrational use. One of the challenges was that you know, public health professionals came into African context and thought it was enough to just tell people, you know, your burial rites are problematic, you're going to infect yourself, and this is how you're going to spread Ebola. And that people would understand that. And in fact, they probably, in many cases, did understand that, but they had to make a rational decision about whether or not, I mean, I'm generalizing now, but in some specific instances, they had to make a rational decision about whether or not to follow their deeply held cultural practices, which would ensure, say, the spirit going into an afterlife, or risk infection themselves. And for them, the rational decision, as I say, in some cases, the rational decision was to risk infection in order to guarantee the afterlife of the family member. And I think this is where I mean, this essentially this is kind of a quintessential illustration of what cultural context is about, and the fact that understanding these contexts is crucially important if we're trying to make health interventions. But I think the problem that we have as Westerners is that we're always kind of externalizing onto the others. You know, that it's the others that have these cultural baggage, and we don't. And of course, within our project, we uncover this all the time. You know, in local kind of situations. In our everyday practice, the antibiotic resistance piece being a case in point. You know, these are powerful influences that affect us all.
I think the deep significance in this particular case as well of burial practices was exacerbated by most of the countries affected being in post-conflict situations where actually questions of rights in the body and burial and these take on, you know, far greater importance than they might have had, you know, 40 or 50 years previously. So this is also a cultural context. Violence is part of the cultural context, and that violence also, as we know, is structural, is conditioned by global dynamics as well. So, you know, culture isn't just you know, a positive expression of a community's consideration of its own histories. It's also the playing out of some deeply difficult and unsavory histories as well.
Sandra, do you want to say something?
Yes, so I mean, I've been working with Niels when he served at the Wellcome Trust as well. So Global Health Histories was a small project, remains a small project since 2005 with very generous funding from the Wellcome Trust in terms of humanities, as far as humanities funding goes. But one of the things we were allowed to do from the very beginning was to have independence, critical independence. And I think humanities is very important, but critical humanities is even more important. So one of the things we've been able to study from inside the WHO and UN, and also help our UN colleagues and WHO colleagues with, is to record institutional memory. Because one of the things you notice working in a complex organization like the WHO is that often there is very weak institutional memory. So there are successful interventions, let's say, in relation to Ebola, and then when the next Ebola outbreak comes, those lessons are not being used. So one of the things GHH has been doing is trying to flag up the fact that, you know, retired officials, the archives of the WHO itself is an enormously rich resource when it comes to responding to current challenges. So let me give you an example. So we're talking about the burial practices. Now, as a historian who was studying this from the inside of the WHO, working on global health histories, what was very striking was this was not just WHO. some of these insights actually came from inter-UN cooperation. So UNAIDS played a very important role because UNAIDS was already working with faith-based organizations in those regions. Those networks came in and helped the WHO. And those faith-based networks were able to provide tremendous intelligence, which were of use to the coalition that was fighting Ebola at that time. As a historian, what was very striking for me was as soon as the problem was sort of sorted, very separate institutional history started coming out again. So UNAIDS came out with its own history, WHO came out with its own history. You had a situation where someone from the then WHO DG's office gave a historical talk about what happened in Ebola and forgot to mention UNAIDS completely. So our role as critical humanities scholars, and I have to applaud Claudia Stein and Niels Whittier that they tolerate critical, troublesome historians like us when we talk like this, and that therein lies the value of global health histories, that we can do evidence-based research and talk about it, even though it might be inconvenient to some groups within the WHO or the UN. So history is very important. So what did that West African Ebola campaign teach us? That inter-UN collaboration was very important. Intelligence from multiple actors was very important. The anthropologists helped us talk to the faith-based organizations. And yet we forget those lessons when we now try to tackle the problem in Congo. So history is also about inconvenient truths. We have to have the fearlessness to speak truth to power. Without that ability to speak. So we need youngsters like you who have an interest in cultural studies, in public policy, because global health histories is very small. We are expanding in Africa with the help of African academics. This is not a civilizing mission. This is a mission for us to learn from our African colleagues. We need you to join that group.
There's an invite for you. Right.
Thank you very much. I'm Pauline Essa, and I'm currently working with the National Institute for Health Research, where my role is
I can't see.
my role is to help manage the use of UK taxpayers' funding for advancing global health research in low and middle income countries. Thank you very much for your very interesting talks, both speakers, and I'm looking forward to more of these discussions as we go along. What I'm wondering is, I've got two questions, please. One is to do with the work that Jonathan did in Nigeria. So I'm wondering, given the importance of history in advancing global health research, what do you think can be done to make sure that the kind of scenes we saw, the heartbreaking scenes where records have been lost over the years, what is being done now, or what can be done going forward, especially with technology and all these advancements, to make sure that we can capture and actually store these documents for use in the present and the future? And along the same lines, I mean, it was great to see the stories of the neglected workers being represented in your publications. But again, what can we do to make sure that this becomes the norm, that people who are contributing to advancing health and healthcare in these areas are not forgotten or sidelined, but that their stories can be captured as the norm rather than as the exception? Thank you.
Well, I should answer that one then. What can be done about the loss of records? Records are lost everywhere. Everywhere in the world, far more records are lost than are kept. And there are very, very good reasons to privilege work with people over work with records. Obviously, in many situations, records can't be a priority. There are some structural interventions you can make to support record keeping, record preservation and protection, such as the training of archivists, the provision of strong boxes, dry storage, things like this, the sensitization of people who have custodial power over records. And some of this has to be done face-to-face, person by person, place by place. One of the a program that I led a few years ago focused on training young Nigerian scholars in history of medicine, doctoral students, postdocs, in methods and research in history of medicine. So we gave them fieldwork funding to go out, identify archives, engage with those archives, canvass for their protection, but also to sensitize them to just the vast range of archival resources that were available in the country. And then the job is the job of the historical profession to engage with people who are interested in archives, who hold archives, who can preserve them. And this is how it develops. More is always lost than kept. And that's, to some extent, that's as it should be. If you've ever gone into an archive looking for a story, there's a lot of stuff that people keep, and God knows why. I'm not meaning to be a nihilist about the archive, but we do have to have a sense of perspective at the same time as we can mourn the loss of the archive like that. I mean, I do mourn it, and which is why I foreground it, to raise questions like that, to point the finger at political processes which make it impossible to maintain archives, because there's so much else to do and there's so much that's more important. I think regarding neglected workers, I mean, our case, our point was to sort of shame the journal in a way into recognizing some of its past practices needed to be addressed, needed to be readdressed. But it strengthened my commitment to making sure that I credit where the conversation is coming from, and not just how I process it. And I think that's something which is important in this case. The agendas are being shaped by people who you don't give credit to for their role in shaping that agenda. You somehow think that your ability to recognize and validate and fund the hunches of somebody else gives you, ownership of that hunch and its outcomes. And that's something that we need to find a way of moving beyond. And that's part and parcel of equalizing partnership, making partnership better, making partnership more equitable, which is something that I, don't have any. I mean, there are people here who have much better track record of answering and addressing those questions. And I know that Sanjoy has his hand up. And
I'll just ask you, because there are plenty of people in the room who actually publish in this sort of area. I mean, is there something that we can do, make a statement about this? The people in the room I know are editors, about making it important that the people who really do provide the material are just forgotten. And sometimes it's because we want to be the first author, and that's part of our career structure, and that's for sure. And it's partly also, I think, culturally, it's just forgotten. So are there any people who are actively publishing there who want to make a comment about this?
It's not easy, so.
It's not easy. Rowan Bernstein, I actually work in Burma. I've been in a FED-funded partnership for the last 4 or 5 years now, DFID-funded. We have been, we're only just starting to publish the work that we've been doing over the last 5 years, but we're absolutely ruthless in making sure that we always have our partners on our papers, our posters. They write posters and we make sure they're first author if they're the prime movers, and we sit in the background. And I think one of the ways of doing it is to make sure that that's tied into your grants and part of the conditions of ongoing grant deliveries that you are tying your partners in.
Anybody else want to? I'm David Dunn, Emeritus Professor of Parasitology at Cambridge. I think the situation is changing as far as authorship and whatever. And I think the most fundamentally important thing about this is actually the leadership of research. authorship of research, for example, in Africa is moving, I think now increasingly rapidly, to have that leadership coming from Africa. And therefore, it won't be a matter of whether visiting scientists can dole out authorships to their collaborators, but the collaborators themselves are are in a prime position to publish their own work and take a lead in this work. And I think this is a really important movement now. We have the African Academy of Sciences really providing major funding for African researchers. And so I'm hoping that this won't be an issue in the future as Africa takes control, for example, of its own research future and invites collaboration from the outside rather than having it dictated from the outside.
I think that does raise, I mean, the question that we were trying to address was not really that question that was raised from the two speakers in the audience. Because there are African research partners. There is the doctor who everything is funneled through, who sits in Yaoundé. What we have here is nurses who never lead anyway research ventures. They are the staff, they are the labor. And so it's a slightly different point because they're not actually going to write the posters.
Yeah. And I think nonetheless, I think the development is in the right direction. I think a bit more can be done. And I think part of the responsibilities of the Africa Academy of Science and the changing dynamics is helping that. But I do appreciate and understand what you're saying. When you look at sort of development over the last 60, 100 years, most of the advances in medicine, Africa particularly has been the biggest laboratory of the world. Most of the trials and things were discovered or were implemented there, trial there, but the benefit didn't translate there. But apart from also that, the roles of institutions and individuals that really played in that, the nurses, the health workers, the communities, is almost non-existent in history at all. That in itself doesn't inspire young people in Africa to see who can they role model for. So it's a lot of multi-component of that. I think the grant is one element of it. But until you hear these human stories, and Sanjoy has done, there is a postdoctoral student now who is working with, I think, Church of England, has done tremendous amount of work of African actors that were engaged with Methodist Church and Mother of the Faith organization in smallpox eradication. But you don't hear, when you read the history of smallpox, you don't hear those things. And I think it's hopefully going to be the norm with these changes. But also the researchers or people involved have some sort of personal responsibility in ensuring those things happen. But I can assure you that from what I know from the African side, people are beginning to take more responsibility on that because knowledge is interdependent, is global. And people are beginning to ensure that those stories are coming out as much as the interventions that we put in place.
But you know, when archives are created, even in well-resourced settings, the act of creating an archive often silences. So again, using smallpox as a good example, very important African figure in global smallpox eradication is Frank Grant. I learned this from my PhD students' research. Without him, the smallpox, measles immunization program in Ghana would have been very difficult because he had the faith-based connections, he had the political connections, he helped WHO officials who would fly in to navigate those politics. But then when you look at a US online archive that is being created right now by the Center for Disease Control to celebrate the 40th anniversary of smallpox control, that name doesn't appear. So what then happens is that the act of creating an oral archive, the act of creating the papers related to the people who are being interviewed, that is then made equivalent to a global program, which at one stroke then takes away 100,000 names, if not more, of actors across Africa and Asia. So we, as academics, I think, because the WHO archives are so rich, have a role in bringing out these names. Once we bring out those names, because we don't know those names, we can then trace the archives that are available all over the world. I mean, these are bureaucratic empires. So even though files are being destroyed in WHO headquarters, copies of that file will be found in the French National Archives or the UK National Archives. So we need an army of researchers to draw out these files. And then we can find out about these neglected, truly neglected African and Asian actors. And that's one of the things global history strives to do through these seminars. So we often find out about these actors, like John told us about, which we otherwise would not know about.
Thank you, Simon. So do you think there's room for us trying to engage a number of funders to start thinking about these areas, to be able to inject some more funding?
Funding is part of the problem, because I actually wrote a letter in support for the WHO Smallpox Archives, UNESCO, which was then digitized. But I find, because I've seen those archives in a non-digitized form, and I now see it in a digitized form, the act of digitization itself has created silences. So money is only part of the problem. We need oversight. Who decides what is important? Who decides whose voice is important? Unless we democratize our understanding of who is important, we'll never create democratic archives. So the UNESCO grant was pretty serious, but I'm very sorry to see that the field reports don't seem to appear in the digitized material, but that the field report is where you will find the local actors' names. What you're finding is a discussion between WHO regional offices and the headquarters. The national actors are not involved in that set of discussions. So money is part of the problem. We have to change our mindset before we digitize. And that's a big battle.
I'm Liz Kimmel. I lost the voice, but I'm not Theresa May. I'm just Professor of General Practice, and a very interesting area that you're talking about the silencing, the act of trying to do the opposite, causing silencing. And it brings me back to Arthur's question about whether there is some way that one can move to make that less likely, because it's not easy to see how it, armies of people doing research, but that actually isn't really on its own going to manage this, I don't think. I remember when I early on working for the MRC, and we changed the way clinical trials were prosecuted by the way people had to apply for the money, by giving them headings that they had to put in some qualitative inquiry to understand mechanism as well as the trial variables and so on. And it does seem to me that there might be a place to just problematize this, because it isn't that one's trying to attack people at different levels or saying how well they've done and so on. It's that it is actually quite difficult to frame how to describe that wonderful story of a man making music with leprosy and the contribution that he made. I was extremely moved by that, and also by your image of the health worker who had managed to make his own house out of hell. Maybe that's enough. Maybe he doesn't want his name in an archive. He wants a house, maybe. I don't know. But I think that to understand at what level people are contributing and how the researcher has a responsibility, of course, to declare their sources, write down where their sources live and so on, could actually be quite helpful. I wonder if the Lancet would be interested in such a thing. The editor of the Lancet is very idiosyncratically broad-minded, narrow-minded, and he might well be interested. But I thought it was a good suggestion.
Well, I hope this can be part of actions that will come out of here, Arthur, if we can link with you and work around, because that's one of the main purpose of today, isn't to see what we might take out as actions and then follow it up. I think Lancet would be a good discussion with Richard, isn't it?
Yes, you.
I mean, I had some thoughts which were slightly in parallel. Obviously, my my background isn't in kind of the African region. Although I do think the problematics that you discuss are, they're global in terms of voices that are heard, voices that are not heard. They're cultural in terms of kind of research cultures, not just simply not being aware of their own practices in the way that you are, perhaps, and hopefully other his colleagues as well. But I did want to maybe piggyback on this this story that you told about Harcourt White, and the fact that you know, the kind of deep cultural impact that this that his kind of story had, his narrative had. And what always strikes me about these kind of things is that these kind of narratives have to battle all the odds. They kind of come up unsupported. People like this, you know, as you were kind of describing, have to band together in places where they've been abandoned, and it's through that kind of struggle and strife that they come to the fore and create something very special. Maybe that's the kind of special sauce, but to some extent, you know, for me, a kind of takeaway message of these kinds of stories is also, you know, let's look at the impact these kind of cultural practices can have, and let's think about ways of supporting that, you know, structurally, not just. Well, I shouldn't say just, because it's great that you're historicizing this, and it's great that you're lending a voice to it, but you know, is there something more one can do about supporting the kind of the power of culture and art in creating these kinds of positive health narratives?
I'm a public health doctor and a public health researcher. I thought it was really great, the focus on culture, on AMR. I'm really interested in research translation, so I just wondered if you could perhaps comment on how best these insights have been used in practice in our response to addressing AMR, and if you had any good examples of that in practice to share with us.
So the policy brief kind of occupies a space, and I'd encourage you to. No, the slide's not up here anymore, but it's, if you type in CCH or cultural context of health into Google, you'll end up on our site, and you can have a look at the policy brief. And I think when putting together the policy brief, we didn't really come across very good examples on the policy level that illustrated a kind of translation of this knowledge. And that's one of the main reasons why we endeavored in writing it and putting forward policy options, considerations that policymakers might want to take. But what we did come across very frequently are, you know, a number of case stories, a number of examples where these things are, you know, where we can draw on examples where cultural practices have very real consequences in terms of antibiotic use and antibiotic prescription. And again, kind of to iterate the point that I was making, this isn't, you know, it's not about irrational use. It's very rational use. It's hierarchies within hospitals, junior doctors kind of referring or being under the guidance of senior doctors and not following guidelines because they need to report, or they are reporting to somebody above them who has different opinions about how to subscribe and prescribe antibiotics. So it's kind of, I think what we came across is a lot of examples of how culture affects these practices. But our hope is that the publication of the policy brief, and hopefully the conversation that follows it, will prompt policymakers to take this a little bit more seriously, with the hope that down the line we will see examples where policymakers kind of use this as a starting point.
Perhaps that is also permeating, whether it's directly or indirectly, to the policies. When you look at the AMR action plan, so each country, certainly in Africa, were asked to draw a national action plans for AMR a couple of years ago. And almost all of them have a big section there, so their objectives around understanding public perception and cultural practices to do with AMR. So i.e. in terms of utilization, how they scale antibiotics and their awareness. Antimicrobial resistance. So that is becoming quite strong element, and I think for majority that I have seen, I think about 80% of them, that is number one objective. Because if you do understand those cultural awareness, it's not only from the physician side, but from the public engagement side of things. So it's permeating. I think increasingly the political economy discussion is mainly about how can your people be able to understand issues and take more responsibility for them, which is part of the cultural dimensions, I suppose.
So, can I ask if you have a personal experience in the research you're doing at the moment?
Yeah, it was more in terms of the practical implementation side of it, because I think there's been a lot said in guidelines and there has been some good action, but still in terms of a broader, let's say more multidisciplinary cohesive response, I think the cultural element needs to be a bit stronger in what I've seen so far.
So we organized a global health history seminar in Colombo in Sri Lanka with the Sri Lankan government, the College of Bacteriologists and the College of Medical Administrators. And what we found was fascinating. The then president of the College of Bacteriologists pointed out that Sri Lanka had indeed received help from the WHO and the Wellcome Trust to prepare a country-specific AMR guideline, but that guideline was only in English and therefore quite useless. It was gathering dust in most hospitals. It hadn't been translated into Sinhalese and Tamil. And many local medical administrators informed us, this is the value of global health histories. History, while talking about history, you can also talk about spiky contemporary affairs. And they spoke about the fact that they were so overworked that they didn't have the time to leaf through a massive document. So their recommendation to us to spread the word was that they needed these to be in snippets, little policy briefs. They needed to be multilingual. We fed that back, but we are yet to see any impact. So I think, Britain is multicultural. I mean, some people don't like that. We have Brexit. Multilingualism is an issue here as well. So, we must always be aware of the fact that, messaging has to be multilingual to be effective. And I think that's true for British minority groups as well. I'm of Bengali origin, of an Indian origin. Messaging could be much better. Yeah, so.
I mean, cultural work doesn't do itself, and very often in public health settings, there's no one to do the analysis that can bring these understandings to bear, in something other than a thick volume which nobody has a chance or the time to read. At the same time, people working in public health are cultural actors, and they are carrying something of their own appreciation of how the problem, everyone has an understanding, everyone in the world of AMR has an understanding of what the biggest problem in AMR is, and that's in a way their cultural baggage when it comes to approaching it. At the London School at the moment, we have an AMR centre which is multidisciplinary in its very conception. It really is trying to bring history, anthropology, health economics and all of that to bear on the questions of antibiotic stewardship. And we know from the very start how hard it is to do this, and how hard it is to get someone to do the society work, to make sure that the society enters the conversation, the culture enters the conversation.
Can I just add one quick thing, because we agree quite a lot on this panel, which is fantastic. But one thing about description of public health professionals is a bit different. Because I see you all as public health professionals. And I see cultural context, history, sociology, medicine, anybody who contributes to the improvement of the public's health is a public health professional. Maybe I'm using different definition, but I always see you as public health professionals.
You must come to LSHTM and tell people that I'm a public health professional.
We'll have time for the last question or point.
Thanks very much for this. My name is Simon Schretter. I'm a professor of public health, public policy and history in Cambridge. The WHO is a UN organisation, and so it's sort of constitutionally wondering to what extent you find that your focus on culture in context and history is bringing you up against constraints, tensions with that, because of course everything we've heard tonight, I think, shows us that to the extent that one achieves fidelity with culture and tries to work with it in a health context, it's moving you quite strongly away from national units, national governments and how they see things and so on. And so it almost makes me wonder that if you're going to take this, trying to push this seriously in a policy direction, it requires a rethinking of how to access resources, how to talk with authorities that could give resources and donate them, because otherwise you're kind of always going to keep coming up against the inconsistency between the nation and its resources and its view and the language that you're trying to work with and so on. So I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
I mean, I think I'm not going to kind of trivialize the challenges, and I think one of the benefits of where we are at the moment is that we are kind of still somewhat under the radar, if you see what I mean. So it's a relatively young program, and to some extent our first ambition, our first kind of goal, is to create awareness and momentum within the organization, right, as opposed to necessarily in ministries of health or in member states. Although I think that's definitely a place that we're gravitating towards. I think initially we want to kind of what we're doing at the moment is working with programs like the nutrition program or the migration program and providing a service to them by giving them access and opportunities to work with researchers that have different perspectives and have different expertise. So I think to some extent we haven't crossed that that bridge, you know, that shaky bridge that you articulate yet. But I also think, you know, that we, you know, at least in the kind of formative stages of this project, we will be working with member states that are interested, you know, where there's a kind of inherent kind of goodwill towards this kind of work, and we haven't yet ventured into those member states where this is kind of perhaps at this point kind of inconceivable or irrelevant or you know, not possible quite yet. So, so that's maybe a bit of a cop-out question, answer rather. But I do think it's not all bad. You know, I don't think that the kind of I think culture, as we've said on a few occasions, is also an enabler. You know, culture is also a kind of a space where people can talk a little bit more freely and a little bit more openly about certain issues than they might otherwise be able to. So my hope is that as the project grows and as we kind of move more into member states, that that aspect of it, the kind of enabling aspect of culture, is something that kind of moves us forward.
And I think through work that we're trying to do, maybe within this program at Hughes and in the University of Cambridge, that's precisely the sort of movement that we want to see happening.
And maybe there are some framing suggestions you may have, sort of how they might frame the discourse, because I can see the challenges you articulate, so you might be helpful in perhaps helping us to shape that as well.
We'll just draw to a close now. Thank you very much indeed to our speakers and the panellists for being here. Thank you to Harry, who a medical student IT technician undertaking the streaming and the wait for the outcome of that, I guess, but taking away from his revision for his finals examination. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for the background staff who've actually, the admin staff and so forth, to make these meetings very possible for us. It's interesting, having spent my career pre-retirement in the NHS, the one thing that kept on coming out was that we have to learn the lessons of this particular incident. We have to learn lessons. You could guarantee every report would say that. And yet most of us working in the NHS knew that the memory of the NHS was non-existent. So I think I went through 3, and Bill here is probably going through the 5th transformation of the NHS in one way or another. The only way to deal with it is to shake it up a bit and have another go at it. And the memory is gone, and I think that's important, how we actually retain memory which is useful, which actually can move forward in institutions and organisations. And we hope that the history part of this is something we do. Those of us who work in disadvantaged parts of the world know that, in fact, culture is probably the most important thing. But what is interesting that when we did a piece of work which Jerry here was involved in both Kenya and in the UK, in areas of rural and urban deprivation, that the issues that came forward were actually the same issues. And that's the globality of it. And it's just as much global health issue, actually, in this country, and probably more so than it was 10 years ago, due to austerity, than actually that the people care to think about. And that's an inconvenient thought at times as well. Thank you very much for your engagement in this evening. We will be having future meetings and seminars. Two topics have come to early to our minds. One is about religion, and the other one about reproductive health. So if you wish to make sure you stay on the list and don't just rely on our publicising through Eventbrite, then please leave your email in a legible form for us so that we can actually make contact with you in the future. Now the real cultural bit, outside there, there's a huge cultural welcome for you with a glass of white wine and a few meals before you find your way back home. But thank you very much, and thank you to our speakers for actually making our inaugural seminar in this area